Today we'll be speaking to how transportation projects are funded, and I'd like to welcome Ed McKinney. Thank you, Ed, and I'll bequeath you.
Okay, thank you, Jill. And I want to welcome folks online and in the room for attending our Citizens Transportation Academy. This is our 5th session, and we're excited to keep bringing these transportation academies to you. And we're grateful that you're participating with us. As Jill said, I'm Ed McKinney. I'm the Planning and Program Administrator here with the Florida Department of Transportation and the District 7 office. We are very lucky today to have Karen Brunel here with us. She is the Director of Project Development at the Federal Highway Administration with the Florida Division. So we're excited that she's joining us. So today we're going to try to answer a question that can be somewhat complicated, and we get asked a lot as we're going out in the community talking with different folks. How are transportation projects funded? Where's the money come from? Who administers the funding? And how is it distributed? So actually I'm supposed to be switching slides. So I'm going to go through this with you, and I'm sure by the time I reach one of those boxes, you're going to understand what I'm talking about. Actually, this is the actual process for funding. However, we're not going to do it. We're going to try to break down all these blocks for you and introduce transportation funding in a simple way. So we're going to answer, again, the top 3 questions are: where does the funding come from? Who administers the funding? And how is it distributed? So where does transportation come from? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't grow on trees, and as much as folks probably think it might, or we wish it would, it actually comes from you, the taxpayers of the state of Florida, whether you drive a vehicle or you live in a house paying residential taxes. It comes from you, it comes from me, it comes from Karen as well, because we're also residents of the state. So how does it get into the transportation system? Let's take a look at some transportation funding sources. Transportation is funded through a mixture of user fees and property taxes, as you can see by this chart. By far, the majority of our transportation system relies on fuel taxes, better known as the gas tax. And there are fuel taxes levied at different levels. They're levied at the federal level, at the state level, as well as the local level. So how much do we pay in fuel taxes? This is kind of a somewhat complicated chart, but there are different amounts for each level of government at the federal level. The fuel tax is 18.4 cents per gallon. And on diesel gas, it's actually 24.4 cents a gallon. The state fuel tax rate in the state of Florida is 20.8 cents a gallon. The different colors on the state and local charts represent different types of fuel taxes, all of which have a different statutory authority and different rules and regulations for how funding is spent. So what does this mean for the average Floridian? So if the average Floridian pays roughly $296 annually in federal and state and local fuel taxes, roughly 111 of that would go into the federal fuel tax pot, 125 into the state fuel tax, and 60 into the local fuel tax pot, which roughly equates to roughly 2.5 cents per mile is what is paid. Karen?
Yeah, and at the federal level, your transportation funding, about 80 to 95% of those funds actually comes from the fuel taxes. The rest of the money actually comes from the truck and heavy vehicle sales tax, user taxes, as well as interest on invested balances. And then back at the state level?
Yeah, and so on the state level, 58% of the revenue comes from the state fuel tax, 30% from motor vehicle fees, and then the rest of it comes from varying dock stamps, surcharges, aviation fuel tax. So on the local level, and this is just addressing on that 3-bar chart, the far right bar. At the local level, transportation is heavily dependent on fuel taxes. There are local fees and government contributions, things like property taxes, but most of the local system is funded via fuel tax, either at the local level or through it could be through federal or state grants that depend on fuel taxes. The Constitution and legislative motor fuel tax listed in the top bullet are imposed and administered at the state level. then dedicated to the local governments according to statute. In addition to this funding, counties are authorized to levy up to 12 cents per gallon in local option tax. This chart kind of illustrates a little bit about how which counties in the state of Florida levy which taxes. Again, you could levy up to 12 cents. Less than half of Florida's counties, though, have levied that 12 cents option. Pinellas and Hillsborough County are at 7 cents, but Pasco, Hernando, and Citrus are at 12 cents.
So let's talk a little bit about inflation and fuel taxes. An important thing to note when we're discussing fuel taxes is that the state fuel tax is adjusted each year due to inflation using the Consumer Price Index as its basis. But the federal tax and the local taxes are not. They stay the same. So the federal fuel tax rate, the 18.4 cents, has been the same since 1993. And the local fuel tax rate, which varies by county to county, as you saw on that last slide, that also is not adjusted each year for inflation. So those numbers stay the same throughout the since forever, 1993. So let's look at an example of what that really means. So take a loaf of bread, for example. The same amount of money can't buy the same amount of product. So if you were budgeting for your family and you had $2 a week in your family budget for buying a loaf of bread, back in 1993 when that fuel tax was first set, you could buy about 2 loaves of bread. It was about $1 a loaf. Well, if you haven't adjusted your budget and you still have only $2 coming in for that fuel, for buying that bread, then now bread's about $2 a loaf. So you can only buy 1 loaf of bread to feed your family. So what does that mean? You either have to adjust your budget, change some priorities, or you find other ways to satisfy your bread needs. And that's kind of what we're faced here with the transportation system. The other challenge to funding transportation is that our vehicles are getting more efficient. So that means that they are traveling more miles using more infrastructure, but not necessarily paying the same amount. They're actually paying less. We've got rising construction costs. So what we could build in 1993 is not necessarily the same as what we could build now, just like that loaf of bread, that the inflation is diminishing that dollar. And then finally, we also have an aging infrastructure, so it actually takes more investments to just maintain what we have.
And it's interesting, here in the state of Florida, we also have population growth that also puts a strain on our system.
Right, and so all of those things factor into how do we manage to continue to invest in our transportation system. So let's talk a little bit about who administers the funding. This can also get quite complicated, but we're going to keep that at a higher level. So from the federal level, the fuel taxes go into what we call a highway trust fund. And even though it says highway trust fund, it's actually a misnomer. The funds actually get split between the highway account and the mass transit account. About 85% of the highway trust fund goes through the highway account, and those are overseen by my agency, the Federal Highway Administration. And then the 15% gets overseen by FTA. And throughout this process, the funds actually get administered by FDOT for both of those funds. The funds that come to this state are administered by FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation. And this is not my side.
Yeah, and on the state level, it's a little more complicated. It's interesting, though. You make the point that 15% of the funds go into funding transit projects. But if you look at the state, it's, as I said, that kind of, you remember the first chart I showed you. I told you I wasn't going to go over it with you, but this just illustrates the complexity of how the state, those gas taxes on the state level, they're distributed. But we provide this for you, and if one evening you're sitting around and you're having trouble falling asleep, this would be a great chart that might help you with that. So just to try to kind of simplify it a little bit, on the state level, the state fuel tax goes into what's called the State Transportation Trust Fund. It's specifically programmed for transportation purposes. And on the local fuel tax side, those monies are redistributed back out to the counties and municipalities, who they administer their own funding. The DOT would manage that first part, the state transportation fund, the trust fund part. The locals and city governments, or the county and city governments, would administer the individual county local fuel tax revenue portion. Again, to recap, just to ensure that folks understand, as I said, this is a very complex process, and we're trying to break this down. So the federal fuel tax, those funds go into the highway trust fund. The state fuel tax goes into the state transportation trust fund. Both of those, the blue and the red buckets, are managed by Florida Department of Transportation. The green bucket, the individual county and municipalities manage the local fuel tax portion.
So let's talk about how funding is distributed. And what you kind of getting a sense that it's really a collaboration, it's a communication is a big thing, both at the federal, state, and local levels. All three levels need to work together to really make the transportation system work. So if you look at this slide, let's start from right to left instead of left to right. So the beauty about the federal transportation program, it is a federally assisted, state administered, locally different program. So what that means is the projects that are needed to do transportation are actually decided at the local level. The federal government says, well, if you're going to use federal funds on a transportation project, then we have some things that you have to do, some processes you have to have in place in order to use those funds. But when you have those processes in place, that end result, that is as a result of the projects you select are the ones that are decided at the local and state levels. So one of those processes that we require is called the Long-Range Transportation Plan. That helps the MPOs. So you learned about the Metropolitan Planning Organizations in another session. So the MPOs are charged with developing the long-range vision, the 20-year vision of the local area. And so that's what we call the long-range plan. You can see some of those on the slide, what those documents are. The state also has to develop a long-range plan. That's called the FTP, the Florida Transportation Plan. That sets out at least that 20-year vision and goals for the state. Then they take those plans and do a near-term, short-term investment priorities, and we call that the TIP and the STIP. You might have heard those acronyms. They're improvement programs. And those really take the first 5 years of those long-range plans and says, okay, these are our near-term projects, and this is what's being put onto the ground. So those plans and those programs are developed based on local input, local processes, and local values and goals, and where that community wants to be in 20 years. So it really starts at the local level. Having that community-based input is really key to making sure that the transport system that we have today and what it looks like in the future has that public input.
And we have our strategic intermodal system, which is the state's high priority network system. And that also receives funding at a state level. And we identify high priority projects within this SIS system to fund using those state funds.
Right, and at the federal level, when you talk about federal assisted, just to give some kind of magnitude, so the state of Florida actually gets about $2 billion in federal transportation dollars to use on their system. And in this state, the state also puts a significant amount of money into your transportation budget. And so there is a large amount of money that needs to be prioritized and prioritized effectively. And that is done through the collaboration at the state and local level through those MPOs. So we mentioned briefly a little bit of rules and regulations. So federal government, we say, yes, you can use our money, but we tie a few strings to it. So we mentioned the long-range transportation plan. That is one of the processes we use to ensure that those federal dollars are being used most effectively. And we have rules at the state level as well, don't we?
We have quite a few of them.
So one of the things here's another example of a rule that we have is the type of funding and how funding gets used. So at the federal level, we have formula funds that are distributed to the states based on population. We also have competitive funds that are more discretionary, that are more of an application-based approach to a project. But whichever way those projects are funded, the key is the long-range plan and those tips. That's what we are looking to as a basis to say, this is what the community needs and wants.
Let me ask you a question, Karen. Could we fund a project that was not on the state's transportation improvement plan with federal funds?
You could not.
So we couldn't prioritize our own projects using federal funds without that process?
Correct, correct. You have to have that place. So you have your long-range vision. That long-range vision is supposed to include not only the federal funds, but the state and local funds as well as how are you going to build, maintain, and improve your transportation system. And then you program those in those tips, but we are going to look to that tip and to the statewide document to make sure that they are included in those documents before we say, yes, use those funds on this project.
Okay. We're going off script a little bit. That's an interesting format that, and what's interesting is this, what you said, it's a local driven process that works bottom up.
Right. And so when we get that request to use the federal funds, we're not looking at the type of project to say whether this is a good or bad project. What we're doing is we're looking to evaluate, did it come from a long range plan? Is it in the current SIP or TIP and TIP? And then is it eligible for that pot of money, which we'll get into here in a little bit. That's what we're looking at when we look at the projects.
So how do we identify those bottom-up projects and identify and get those to federal highways using our 5-year work program? This is our commitment to the public and us being transparent and showing how those funds are going to be spent on specific projects. And how the program works, it's a 5-year plan, and it's a revolving 5-year plan. So as 1 year drops off, a new year's added. So it's always a 5-year plan. Now, the state's federal fiscal year, or the state's fiscal year, runs from June to July, or July to June. The federal fiscal year is October to September.
Correct. So that puts a little bit of confusion into the process.
So the program is developed with various projects, identifying safety and security, system preservation, which is a high priority. We don't want to build something that we can't maintain. Obviously, multimodal enhancements where we can provide alternative modes of transportation. We want to, if they're high priorities, particularly on the local level, we want to make them high priorities for us as well. Operational improvements, things that could improve things and are generally less cost but more effective and improvement. We fund those, and then we also fund capacity improvements, projects where we're widening roads or adding additional capacity. But all of these projects are based on NPO priorities and other local government priorities such as TBARTA, which is the local regional transit authority, the TMA, the traffic management area, which is made up of participants from Pasco County, Pinellas County, as well as Hillsborough County. And then, as I said before, our strategic intermodal system, FDOT priorities as well.
And I might mention with the work program, that is integrated with the STIP. So the state does the work program as their own document, but it is integrated with the STIP. So that is the basis for the STIP itself here in the state too.
So if we were to modify the STIP, would that not require the NPO to approve that?
Correct.
So that's part of the process. That's
part of the process. And actually, the NPO, if they have a project in their area, it actually has to come from the NPO first, and then it gets actually unchanged. Once the NPO develops their TIP and adopts it, it's supposed to be unchanged in the submittal into the STIP.
Very interesting. And I just for information, that often slows down a project because if we change limits, if we change description, if we change type of work, all of those are changes to the document.
They are, but one of the great things about the state is you have an excellent STIP online system, so we can approve a STIP amendment within a matter of hours if needed, if we coordinate ahead of time and we know we have to do it. I think we've done it within 24 hours, that the MPO takes an action to amend their TIP, then they coordinate with the districts to get that submittal into FDOT, and you all do your process and it gets submitted to us and then we can approve it. So we have done a 24-hour turnaround time from adoption to approval.
And Federal Highway has always been a great partner with us. So this next slide kind of illustrates a little bit about what are some of the project phases that we program. And in the 5-year program, you may not see every one of these phases for a particular project because each one of those phases takes a amount of time to complete. Typically, it's 2 years in between each of those processes. It could be shortened or extended depending on the size of the project. And in the case of like right-of-way acquisition, where it's where the funding is going to require multi-year funding, we might fund that acquisition over several years. But ultimately, the goal is once a project enters that plan, you want to see it through completion.
Correct, and actually those same phases are found in the long-range plan as well.
Yes.
So, but the challenge is in the long-range plan you have a bigger vision. So at the long-range, 20-year vision, you have a broader picture of what that project is. So as you go through the process and you get better defined on the timing of when funds are available and you're programming the money, even though it might be one project in the long-range plan, it might show up as 2 or 3 projects in that step because of timing of the funding and that sort of thing. But those phases are still there, and you should be able to tie between the 2 documents.
Exactly, and in the PD&E, the project development environmental phase, you often see that where a project is split into several design phases, right-of-way construction phases, because either the project's too large or it's better to build it in stages.
Or some part of the project might need right-of-way and another part may not, and so getting those processes through, yes. So provide some flexibility. So let's talk a little bit about the funding. We mentioned that the Highway Trust Fund covers both highway and transit projects. And the way we fund them is a little bit different as well. So for the highway projects, the majority of our funding categories are based on formulas and formula programs. We do have some competitive grant programs, but that's the minority. And then Congress can also earmark the federal transportation dollars for specific projects. And then with both programs, you have a required match. So what that means is federal highways will put in a certain amount of money depending on the type of program. It's typically an 80% federal, and then there's a 20% either a state or local match, depending on what those priorities are at the local and state level. And that can vary. So you might have some programs that are an 80-20 match, some are 90-10, and there are some safety projects you can actually fund at 100% federal highway dollars. On the transit side, it's a little bit opposite in that they have more competitive grant programs that require the application process and fewer formula programs and portion programs. And their match is typically stops at 50%. That's the max that they will pay for on a project. And so then we would look to the state or the locals to fund that other 50% of the project. So let's look at an example. So say the MPO is doing their process, they've got their long-range plan, and they've identified a transit project that's going to cost $100,000. So they go through and they look and they say, okay, I know that the federal funds, this is eligible for federal funds, and the federal funds will pay for $50,000. So then they would then come to the state and say, all right, Ed, do you have money to help us build this project?
And the state would. The state will contribute up to 25% of that match. So in this case scenario, the state would contribute $25,000 towards the capital cost of that project, expecting the locals to pick up the remaining $25,000 and commit to the long-term operation and maintenance.
Right, and I think that's a really important point. Federal funds are not able to be used for operations and maintenance, and at the local level too, you all require commitment for that aspect as well, whether it's a transit project or a highway project as well.
Highway project, well, that could depend on the type of project, but yes, on transit, it's definitely true that they would be required to pick up that operation and maintenance and have a commitment for a long-term commitment.
And I think that's part of the challenge as well. Once you build it, then they'll come, but you still have to maintain, and that's the harder part. That's a larger part. Like the starter, we give you the starter part, but the more long-term thing is at the local level. So I mentioned that highway funding programs. Here are some samples of formula-based programs. So what that means is they're distributed by formula to the state based on population, some other factors. And the thing to realize is that each of these programs just can't be used for anything. There is a great reference that we have on the Citizens Transportation Academy list. There's a list of references. One of the ones that is a really great resource is called Guide to Federal Aid Programs. And that's kind of our cheat sheet. And it has the background of how long this funding source has been around. It tells you what the match requirements are. And it tells you what types of projects are eligible. So you could have a guardrail project that's eligible for 2 or 3 different types of funding. And so that lets the people that are programming the projects, the locals and then those at the state know, okay, well, if I have this project, I can use this, this, and this type of funds. So it really is a balancing effort to try to figure out which projects can use which funds. And it's a challenge because you want to make sure you use up all of the funds you have available to you each year. So there's a lot of mixing and matching and going back, and then when project schedules change or costs come in at either higher or lower, you have to really do some adjustments to make sure you get those funds used. At the federal transit area, and we had a transit session last week, their primary funding is the Capital Investment Grant Program, and that's a competitive program, and they are going through that process right now. And I think the main thing is, and we've seen the same thing with the Tiger discretionary program, is we have far more needs than we have funds available. So trying to make sure that projects are competitive when you go into the pot, because you're not just competing with other Florida projects, you're competing with other national projects around the country. So, and there is a criteria and a rating evaluation process that goes with that as well.
So what we're going through now is we're actually going through a regional transit feasibility plan development, and to try to make that most competitive projects to submit into the federal process. And this was last week's session that we had, and we're moving that process forward, hopefully entering into the federal process. So you heard about the federal capital investment grant. We also have a state. There's also state transit funding sources. We have several programs. We have a New Start program. We have programs for intermodal development, county incentive grant programs, public transit block grant programs, various programs that we have available to us to encourage the use of transit and to promote the use of transit where it's appropriate. The key thing, and with all these complexities, what's interesting is how well we work together. So as these projects are going through the development process, we work hand in hand with our federal partners, with folks in Tallahassee, to find the best use of the funds and the most appropriate use of the funds that's available to try to realize those local priorities and help make them happen. So there's a wealth of information that's out there. If this has got you a little excited and if you're interested in learning more about the transportation funding process, as Karen alluded to, the process begins on the local level. So your local NPOs, Fort Pinellas, Hillsborough NPO, Pasco NPO, or if there's another NPO in your area, they will have information on the long-range transportation planning process all the way through their priority, their transportation improvement plan priority list. Also, you can find information on fdot.gov, where we also have information on state-funded programs, as well as how we integrate with those local programs.
Right, and at the federal level, we have another great reference. It's called Financing Federal Aid Highways. And then again, there's a link to this on the Citizens Transportation Academy. And it just goes more into detail about the federal process of funding transportation projects and where it starts and how it works. And I really like the book. It's very much plain language to read and understand that process.
All right. So now we'll open it up to questions.
Okay. Our first question is District 7 planning to use the Florida Department of Transportation Financing Corporation for funding any projects?
Well, we'll look at all sources. It's as I said, it's hard to say we're going to do. When people ask me, how are you going to fund this? If it's a competitive grant type project process, we look for all types of sources of funding. It's hard to predict in the future what we're going to use or when we're going to use it. We would rather say, let's create a project that's competitive, and then let's go after whatever we can.
This kind of ties into another question about there seem to be a lot more public-private partnerships happening in transportation. Do you imagine that that will be more common in the future, as you were talking about kind of how far the gas tax can go and identifying funding sources?
Well, it's got to be good for the state. And when I say good for the state, it has to be good for the citizens of the state of Florida first. So if there's a public-private partnership or a private organization that's interested in helping us advance some of our initiatives or priorities or needs, we will definitely have those conversations, and we will look for ways that we can be a partner with a private. Brightline is a great example of how that partnership could work, and how local needs and transit needs could partner well with private organizations. So we would look at, we would entertain, but it has to be something that works for the state of Florida and the citizens that live here.
And at the federal level, that's certainly something we've done previously. I think working in partnership is an option open to all of us. There are some states, though, that don't have enabling legislation, so they can't actually enter into public-private partnerships. So this state does, and we've done several projects in that fashion.
And public-private partnerships doesn't necessarily mean a financial give and take. It could be providing some level of service. It could be providing land, and we do that quite a bit. Local developers and local landowners may, with a project that's on a priority list, may want to advance that project and may be willing to provide property for us to advance a project. We would definitely have those conversations, and where it makes sense, we definitely would consider it.
Another question was, can you move highway funds? You talked about the 85% into the highway fund and the 15% into transit. Can that be moved around?
Right. So if you have a transit project, yes, there is a process to flex. We call it flexing highway funds over to FTA transit. It all starts with the MPO, and so once the MPO decides that they're going to do a transit project and they want to do that, then they would request of FDOT to flex the funds to FTA. Then it comes to our office. We process it, and they do some magic up in Washington and transfer the funds, and then the MPO and the state have those funds available, and they would work through FTA to get the project developed.
Another question we got is about how toll money is used. Since we have tolls, some states don't have tolls. We have tolls here in Florida. How does that funding feed into this?
So if the project is bond finance, you're going to pay for the operation and maintenance. You want to make sure the system's operating. Then you're going to pay for the debt service, and then remaining funds will stay within the geographical area where the tolls were collected for other improvements, whether to that system or other systems. And then funds could also be used for transit services as well.
And then I think this is the last question. How do you think changing technology, things like Uber and Lyft, and the possibility of automated vehicles changes how we plan to fund things in the future?
That's a great question. I think we're starting that conversation now, and it's not just necessarily funding, but how do you plan for that transportation system? So the long-range plans. How do you put out, what do you decide to do, what infrastructure do you need for those systems to be able to be used in the next 20 years? Do you need something like that? And so I think starting the conversation now, it will definitely have an impact. Can't say whether it's positive or negative or how that is just yet, but it will definitely change how we approach the transportation system.
And if you look at what the state of Florida is doing to prepare with SunTrax, for example, the Turnpike test track at Florida Polytech University. What we're doing with autonomous technology, with transit programs and various rideshare programs such as the Hyperlink in the USF area. We realize this is an emerging technology that will have an impact. We are trying to get in front of what that impact is going to be. But as we look at things like express lanes and ensuring that where we can, we put 2 express lanes in an area instead of in each direction as opposed to 1, thinking in the future maybe one of those lanes could be converted to an autonomous vehicle lane, for example. So all of these different ideas, technologies, we're looking at opportunities and we're trying to get not just be working with industry, but get in front of realizing that when we build a road, it's for the long term. We don't build something for the next 10 years. We expect it to be operational for a long period of time. So that's definitely something that the Florida Department of Transportation is interested in and heavily invested in.
Are there any other questions from anyone in the room before on funding?
I'm sure I do. I'll go watch the webinar because I just missed it.
Okay.
It's just over there.
Okay.
And we do want to mention that we did finish a little bit early today. If anybody missed previous ones, they can go back and view those on the website. And if you have questions, you can always email us if we didn't get to something today.
Okay. And I just want to again thank Karen.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
This is having you here alongside me. They hear it from me, but now they heard it from the source. So
They
thank
do,
you so
yes.
much.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. This is great.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Did you go through the funding for the various modes?
Yes.
Okay, so on the transit piece, you mentioned that you have to have local funding, both for the capital and then the O&M into perpetuity, basically, right?
Yep, that was
Okay.
mentioned.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Ed and Karen both for a great session. We'd like to encourage all of our viewers to join us again. You're always welcome to join us in person or via our live webinar, and watch at your convenience by viewing on our TampaBayNext.com. We have our next session will be next week. Will be on a Thursday, November 2nd. Where we'll be speaking to congestion management strategies. But if one of our previous webinar courses is of interest to you, please take a moment to visit TampaBayNext.com and in our section Get Involved. And there is an entire area dedicated to our Citizens Transportation Academy. With that, we thank you for joining us. And again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to submit those to us via the website.